Welcome back to these videos on naming binary compounds. So this is the third video, the third part of this three-part series. And so if you didn't see the first two parts, the first part was just a general overview of naming binary compounds, which focused on distinguishing between ionic and covalent compounds, because that's the first thing that you need to do when you are naming a compound. The second video focused on the naming of ionic compounds, and now this video is going to focus on how to name covalent compounds. So as a quick review, when you start off and you're going to name a binary compound, meaning it's a compound that's made up of two things, so it's either going to be made up of two different elements, or it may include one of those things might be a polyatomic ion, or both of them. But when you're going off to name a binary compound, you do need to start by asking whether you have an ionic or a covalent compound, because both ionic and covalent compounds have different sets of rules for naming them. And so if you have a metal and a non-metal element, or you have a compound that contains polyatomic ions, that means you have an ionic compound, and you'd use the ionic naming system, which I talked about in the previous video. But if you're dealing with nonmetals, so you have a nonmetal and a nonmetal element making up this compound, then you're going to want to use your covalent naming system. And if you go back and you watch the first video, I talked about how the rules we're going to talk about here don't apply to organic compounds, which would be compounds that are made up of carbon and hydrogen, and they don't apply to naming acids. So those have their own rules for naming, which we're not going to talk about. But if you want to know more about which compounds don't fall under these naming rules, check out the first video. But we're going to focus on naming inorganic binary covalent compounds today. And so I think this is actually a little easier than naming ionic compounds, because really all you need to do, again, is you're going to name the first element in the compound and the second element. And the piece that's different from naming ionic compounds is that we do need to indicate in the name how many atoms of each element we have. So if we're talking about the first element in a compound, we're going to have the element's name from the periodic table. But we also need a prefix to indicate the number of atoms. And so this prefix is the number of atoms in the molecule of that element. So these are the prefixes that we use for covalent compound naming. And so if your compound contains two atoms of that first element, you'd use di, and going on down the list. And I will go through a couple examples at the end, which will show how we use these prefixes to form specific compound names. But that's the only thing you need for the first element of the compound. You just have a prefix indicating the number of atoms and the element name. And the second element is almost the same thing with one small difference. So we are going to use a prefix to indicate the number of atoms of that element, and then the element's name. And then the one thing we will do to the second element is we will change the ending or the suffix on that element name to IDE or IDE. So IDE is the ending. And that's actually all there is to naming covalent binary compounds. So let's go through these three examples that I have up here. So we'll start with H2O. Now you probably recognize this formula as water, but water is the common name, it's not the systematic name. So if we want to name water systematically, we need to identify the elements in it. So we've got hydrogen and we have oxygen. And we have two hydrogen atoms bonded to the oxygen. So we will need to use a prefix to indicate that there are two of them. That prefix is going to be di. So our first element will just be named dihydrogen. And then the second element is oxygen, and there's 1. So the prefix for 1 is mono. But one thing that does happen with these names is you drop extra vowels with these prefixes. So a lot of times you'll leave off the last vowel in the prefix if the element starts with a vowel. So instead of having monoxide, I'm just going to have monox. And then instead of oxygen, I am going to change that whole ending to I. So I get monoxide. So I have 1 oxygen in that second term, and then the ending changed to IVE. So the systematic name for water is dihydrogen monoxide. So now let's look at this next example, N2O3. So this molecule has 2 nitrogens and 3 oxygens. So I need to use prefixes to indicate the number of atoms. So I'm going to use di for the nitrogen again. And then I have 3 oxygen, and I'm going to use tri. And so for these prefixes that end in I, so di and tri, we do not drop that vowel ever. So we are going to keep all the vowels, and we will have, for my second element, trioxide. So I have 2 nitrogen with the di, and I have 3 oxygen indicated by my tri, and then I change the end of the second element to IDE, or IDE. Okay, now our last example down here is CF4, so I have a carbon and I have 4 fluorine atoms. So again, we're going to name the first element and we're going to name the second element in the name. And this brings in a little bit of a catch, something that's maybe not quite totally systematic, which is that if you have only one of the first element in a compound, you actually omit the prefix. So for the first element, you can omit the prefix if it is 1 or if it is mono. However, with the second element, you always use a prefix. So we saw up here with water that you have dihydrogen monoxide. So you put that mono prefix in to indicate that there's 1 oxygen. But here, since the 1 atom element is my first element, I don't use mono, I just write carbon. So I'll have carbon. And then I do need to indicate that I have 4 fluorine, so I will use the tetra prefix for the second element. And so I will have tetra, and I'll change the ending to ide, so I will have tetrafluoride. So those are 3 examples of naming covalent compounds. That's basically all there is to it. The one thing to keep in mind is if you have 1 of the first element, you don't need to use a prefix and you just put the element name. But other than that, you will just be naming elements using a prefix to indicate the number of atoms of each element, and then the second element, the ending always gets changed to IDE. Okay, so that is the end of these 3 videos on naming ionic and covalent compounds. So if you didn't watch the first couple and you want to know more about distinguishing ionic or covalent compounds, or go through the rules for naming the ionic compounds, you'll want to check out the previous 2 videos. And I recommend combining the flowchart that was created here in this video for covalent compounds with the rules for naming the ionic compounds that I went over in the previous video, so that you have them all together in one flowchart that you can use to name any compound you're given. I didn't do that because it wouldn't fit on my board, but you want to make sure that you're practicing naming a mixture of ionic and covalent compounds, because the key really to getting the right name is this first step where you distinguish between an ionic and a covalent compound. Because if you don't make that identification correctly, then you're not going to end up with the right name. So make sure that you're considering both of those things, and good luck with your naming. Practice naming lots of compounds, and practice using names of compounds to go the other direction and get formulas, which is something I might make a video on next.